Hey, welcome to another video. Let me just preface this by saying if you're pretty comfortable with your lenses and you know the advantages and disadvantages to a prime lens over a zoom lens or vice versa, then maybe this video isn't for you and I'll save you some time, you can move on. If you're one that you're not really sure which you should travel with, or if you're relatively new to photography and you're starting out and you're not really sure if you should build a collection of prime lenses, zoom lenses, or a little bit of both, then maybe stick around and watch this video for a little bit. What I'm specifically going to be doing is comparing the Nikon 24-120 f4 lens at 50 and 85 millimeter to the Nikon's 50 and 85 millimeter prime lenses, and showing you both at f4 and I think f8, f5.6 maybe, and then also showing you a couple images at f1.8 to give you an idea of what maybe the advantage of a prime lens would be over a zoom lens in certain situations. And we'll talk about all that in just a minute when I get to the computer. Before I get to the computer, I just wanted to update everybody as to why I haven't been putting out as many videos as I normally do. I used to try to do them weekly, and now I've only been doing one or two a month over the summer here. What happens is I live in a little bit older house, and I'm an older guy, and things break down in the house and me. I think I've had 5 different projects going on in the house here over the summer, between my pool leaking and termites and just different issues. And then I've gone to 3 different doctors who've had me do different things, blood work, and I had a procedure done earlier just this week. You know, the one where they flush out your system and you got to drink that goopy stuff, and which isn't fun. And then they end up putting the camera up your butt. Well, as they were just about ready to put the camera up my butt, I asked the nurse, I said, "Are you using a Canon lens or a Nikon lens up my butt?" And she looked at me like I was an idiot. And then the anesthesiologist said, "Oh, ha ha ha, a camera joke." They didn't answer my question, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the recovery room. I guess you shouldn't tell jokes right before they're ready to put you out. Anyway, I just wanted to give you a little bit of update. Hopefully I'm sort of at the end of that cycle, and hopefully all the tests come back clear and I can move on with life again. So let's get to the computer and let's start talking about prime lenses versus zoom lenses. As you can see, I'm at the computer now. And the first thing that I want to mention is any image I show you is straight out of camera. There are no texture, clarity, exposure, color correction. There's nothing done to any of them. In this example, the Nikon 50-1.8 is on the left. The 24-120 is in the center. And for good measure, I threw in the Voigtlander F2 Apo on the right. They're all shot at f4 only because the 24-120 is an f4 zoom lens. I'm not sure how easy or hard it would be to see on your screen, but the center one, the 24-120, to me on my screen is just a hair brighter. The left and right images are a little bit more flat. Now, these were all raw files that I had to put into JPEG so that I could show them on YouTube. But the raw files are a little bit more flat, which is a good thing, because that means if you were to then go and manipulate the files, you can do a little bit more with the prime lenses than you can with the zoom. But I gotta tell you, it is minimal. As you can see by the image here, it really is minimal. I did some pixel peeping, and at 100% you could barely tell a difference even in the corners. At 200%, the two primes held up just a little bit better, and the Voigtlander held up, I mean, just a hair better than the Nikon, which goes to show you that even the zoom lenses, now the 24 to 120 is known to be an excellent zoom lens, the S lens, and it really is. And I think this is showing you, put up against the primes at 50 millimeter, it's really hard to tell the difference, even when you pixel peep. Now, also keep in mind, when you have a zoom lens like this, say a range of 24 to 120, that mid-range 50, 85 millimeter is going to be the sweet spot for that lens. When you get to the edges at 24 and 120, you may not get quite the same results, but this 24 to 120, even at the both ends, still holds up really well. Here we are at 85 millimeter, the Nikon 85-1.8 on the left, the Nikon 24 to 120 f4 on the right. They're both shot at f4. And I'm not sure how easy you can see, but the one on the right is a little bit brighter again. And when you were to look at the raw files as opposed to these JPEGs over a YouTube video, it's a little bit more pronounced. So the Nikon 24 to 120 lens is a little bit brighter than the primes, even with the raw files, which again to me means you can manipulate the raw files a little bit more as far as dynamic range. So when it comes to, say, landscape images, that's where a prime would outshine it. But I mean, it is so minimal at 50 and 85 so far that you just would be hard pressed if you're shooting landscapes to say, well, I need to shoot the primes over this 24 to 120. Is there an advantage? Probably, but to me, it's minimal, at least for landscapes. Here's the Nikon 50 millimeter at f4 with a little bit of daylight. Now take a look at the 24 to 120 at approximately 50 millimeter at f4 in the daylight. Again, I think you'll see that the 24 to 120 is a brighter lens in the center, and it's even a little bit more pronounced once you get outside with some daylight. Let's move over to the 85 f1.8 lens shot at f4, and also pay attention to the focal length, because I was trying to stand in the exact same spot so I could also show you the difference between the focal length at 50 millimeter versus the focal length at 85 millimeter. Again, the 85 raw file was a little bit more flat, and the 24 to 120 85 had a little bit more punch to it. That seems to be holding up throughout all the different tests. One last example. Here we are back with the 50 millimeter lens at f8. And if you're new to photography and you question, well, why would you shoot it at f8 instead of f4, especially for a landscape? Well, the idea is at f8, from front to back, there'll be a little bit more in focus. If you look at the foreground where that street is and maybe some of the oil patches or whatever they are there, they're going to be a little bit more in focus than they would be at f4. And same with the house. The tiles on the house, there's going to be a little bit more in focus than they would be at f4. I don't want to get too technical, but when you're shooting at a long distance like that, the compression changes it where a little bit more would be in focus. What landscape photographers will typically do is they'll do a process called focus stacking, where they'll take an image of the foreground, maybe the midground, and the background, and then they'll go into Photoshop or whatever program they use, and they'll combine those three images to put the areas that are in focus all into one image. It will actually look like when they took the photograph, everything was in focus. maybe it really wasn't even at f8. When you start going out to, say, f16 on a lens, which would put even more in focus, you start running into other problems with the lens. And again, I don't want to get into getting too technical on you, but usually the sweet spot of just about any lens is going to be f5, 6, f8, and not everything is going to be in focus there. And so the way around it is to focus stack. And again, in the end, you'll see that the 24 to 120 is a little bit brighter. I also did the 50 millimeter Voigtlander, and again, it was really hard to tell the difference between the Voigtlander and even the Nikon. That Nikon 50 millimeter 1.8 is an excellent lens, as is the Voigtlander f2 Apo lens. They're both great lenses. And this 24 to 120 f4 lens, it's really hard to beat. For a zoom lens, I'm sorry, but it really is. And these tests are proving it when you put it up against the primes. It's just an excellent lens. The one thing that I failed to mention was that these were all shot with a Nikon Z8. The next two images were ones I took just a couple of days ago with the 24 to 120 f4 lens. I think they were both shot at f4. But it gives you an example of how good that lens really is. Okay, Mike, you convinced me. Zoom lenses can compete with prime lenses these days, especially the upper end ones like the Nikon 24 to 120 f4. Why then would I ever buy a prime lens? You can't take this image with the 24 to 120 f4. This was taken on the Voigtlander f2 Apo, and it was shot at f2. Look at the bugs on the table in front of my grandson and see the fall off. That's really hard to do with an f4 lens. You get that shallower depth of field, especially when you get down to f2 or even lower, say f1.4, f1.2, which I don't have a 1.2 or an f4 lens. I do have a 75 millimeter f.5 lens, which I'll show you here in just a moment. And what happens is you get, when you have that shallower depth of field that you can get with a good prime, you get the fall off and you get the separation between your subject and its surrounding. Also with primes, each one has a different bokeh, or bokeh as they say, meaning what does that background look like? Is it buttery? Does it have cat's eyes? Is it more circular? They're all a little different. And so you have to know the lens that you're going to buy before you buy it. One of the reasons why I like the Voigtlanders is they seem to have a little bit more of a smooth and buttery fall off than some of the other lenses. And that's why I like the Voigtlanders. The Nikon 85 and the 50 millimeter are pretty similar with the bokeh, and that's why I like those lenses as opposed to some of the other ones. Now, I've never owned a Leica lens. I've seen where they have the separation as well, which is why some Leica users just love those lenses. I'm not as familiar with those. And again, with the Canons, the Sonys, the Fujis, I just haven't used them. But I know that there are slight differences. So depending on what camera system that you are into, just be aware that when you go to the primes, that bokeh could be a little different between each lens. And so do your research. Also, when you go into low light situations, let's say you're traveling and you're inside of a church and there's not a lot of light, well, you're going to want that faster aperture. Now, what does that mean? If you don't understand what that means is, let's say you're at f1.2 or 1.4. The opening in the lens is going to be wider than it will be at say F8. And what happens is the light can pass through the glass. It'll come through that lens with a bigger burst and a lot faster. And that's how you can A, smooth out those backgrounds and get that separation, and B, if you know about your exposure triangle, then you don't have to use quite as high of an ISO to get the same exposure. So those are reasons why you might want to have a prime lens with you. I typically travel, at least recently since I've had the 24-120, no matter where I go, if I'm going on vacation or going just about anywheres, I take that 24-120 with me because you can do so many things with it. But I also typically travel with at least one prime lens and sometimes two, depending on where I'm going. Next year, if I go back to Europe, I'll take the 24-120, and I'll probably take either the Nikon or the Voigtlander 50mm prime with me. I don't think I'd take the 75 or the 85, but I would take a 50 just because when you get in low light situations. Now, if you want to do astrophotography, that's when you need that fast lens. You need that wider aperture. And again, that's where you would want a prime. So it really boils down to what is it you like to photograph? What is it you're going to do? My personal recommendation would be, and this is why a lot of times when, at least nowadays, in the old days when you bought a camera, your kit lens would probably be a 50mm lens. Now it's usually a zoom, a 35-70. I think Nikon even has like a 24-50 or something like that. And those are typically what they call kit lenses. They're not their top of the line lenses, but they're good enough to get started with. And they're typically zoom lenses now that'll come with the kit. And the reason why is because the zoom lenses are so much closer in quality to the prime lenses than they used to be. There used to be a much bigger separation. 30 years ago, there was a huge separation between a prime lens and a zoom lens as far as the quality of the lens. Now they've become so close that unless you need it for low light or you really need to blow out that background, say for a wedding photographer or a portrait photographer, yeah, then you really want to use prime lenses. So they still do have purposes. And I still will keep a couple, 3 prime lenses for that reason, because I shoot a lot of portraits and I like to blow out that background. So when I'm around my grandkids or when I know I'm going to shoot a portrait, I usually have a prime lens with me. If I'm just kicking around town or going on travel, I'll take the zoom lens. Will typically be on my camera body. So it really depends on what it is you want to photograph. And if you're new to photography, learn what that is and then decide on what lens you might want to go for if you want to go for a prime. If you're more of a landscape type person, you might want to go for a 20, 24, 28mm prime along with your zoom. If you tend to be more of a walk around town street photographer, you might want a 28, you might want a 24 prime. If you're a portrait person, you might want an 85 prime or even the Voigtlander 75 prime, depending on your systems. Again, each camera brand has slightly different primes, but typically they're going to have a 35, a 50, an 85 focal length. Some of them will have 24s, 28s, 20s. It really depends on the camera brand. The big camera brands are going to have them all. And some of the camera brands, like Nikon, allows other manufacturers to adapt to their mounts. Not all do. Canon's a little bit stingier when it comes to that. I think Sony allows for other camera manufacturers to use their mount. Most camera manufacturers will allow third parties to use their mount, but not all do. So again, keep that in mind when you buy into a camera system. And I'm not down on Canon. I've never owned a Canon. I don't care. but just be aware that they're a little bit stingier when it comes to allowing third parties to get into their system as opposed to some of the other camera brands. Okay, well, I hope you learned something. If so, please like and subscribe, and hopefully I can put out another video here in the not too distant future and not be so much of a stranger. But until then, you take care of yourself. Bye for now.